In Conversation with Terry Shepard, award-winning broadcaster, narrator, and author. A deep dive into the writer's craft with the artists and support systems who create the stories we love.
Thanks, Lisa. Dennis Palumbo is one of those Renaissance men that make the rest of us feel like slackers. Formerly a Hollywood screenwriter responsible for hits like the film My Favorite Year and television's Welcome Back, Kotter, Dennis is a licensed psychotherapist specializing in creative people. He contributes articles and reviews to the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Lancet, Psychotherapy Networker, and various clinical journals. His mystery fiction has appeared in Ellery Queen's mystery magazine, The Strand, and elsewhere, and is collected in From Crime to Crime. His series of mystery thrillers, the newest is Panic Attack, features Daniel Rinaldi, a psychologist who advises the Pittsburgh police. He served as consulting producer on the acclaimed 2022 Hulu TV series, The Patient, starring Steve Carell. During our conversation, word came that Bob Newhart had passed away at the age of 94. One of Dennis's many incarnations was a stand-up comic during the profession's golden age, and we had the chance to talk about his 2-hour conversation with Newhart and an encounter with another famous television mental health professional, Kelsey Grammer's Frazier. But let's begin with the books, as Dennis Palumbo gives us the backstory on his Daniel Rinaldi series.
Well, I've always loved mysteries. Daniel Rinaldi, my series of Daniel Rinaldi books, for those who may not know, there are 6 so far in the series, and he is a psychologist who is a consultant with the Pittsburgh police. He works with the victims of violent crime, people who survived, let's say, a carjacking or a rape or a home invasion, but are still traumatized by that experience. They have symptoms we associate with PTSD. And my hero, Daniel Rinaldi, that's his mission, because he and his wife, years before the book start, were coming out of a restaurant. They were mugged by an armed man. They were both shot. His wife died, but Rinaldi, after 3 months in the hospital, recovered. And so he is burdened by survivor guilt. And that's one of the things that motivates him to do the stuff he does in the novels.
Where did this love of mystery writing come from?
I was introduced to the mystery genre by my father. I was 10 years old and I had the mumps. And he brought me an illustrated copy of The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. I had never read Holmes or any mystery. I devoured that book. And ever since then, it's still exciting. If somebody says, Watson, the game's afoot, my heart starts racing, and I don't care who says it. You know, it can be Jeremy Brett could say it, Benedict Cumberbatch could say it. What the heck? Basil Rathbone can say, I don't care who says it. But the moment somebody says that, I'm excited. So I started reading every mystery I could get my hands on. And even when I was working in show business as a writer in television and in film, I began sending and writing short stories, mystery short stories to magazines.
What are your memories of that first submission that was accepted?
I had one of those weird weeks where the same week that my then writing partner and I were hired to write for Welcome Back, Kotter was the same week that I sold my first short story to Ellery Queen's mystery magazine. That was a great week for me because I was only 25 and I thought things are going to be great. And then the next 17 bumpy years in show business, some of them great, some of them not. And on the whole, very, very lucky. Things turned out pretty well for me.
Including a little movie script you wrote with actor Peter O'Toole in mind that became the Richard Benjamin film My Favorite Year. Did mystery writing remain on your mind throughout that period of your life?
All the time I was writing for film and TV, I was still writing mystery short stories. But it wasn't until I left show business and became a licensed therapist. I totally changed my career. I retired from show business, and I've been a licensed psychotherapist in private practice for almost 31 years. but I never lost my desire to create a series character. I always wanted to do it. And then I finally realized, what are the two things I'm most interested in? Therapy and my hometown of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And so I put together the idea that Daniel Rinaldi was going to be like me, an Italian-American from a blue-collar family, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, the first in his family to go to college, first one to not have a blue-collar job. And so he has a foot in the blue-collar world and a foot in the white-collar professional clinician world. And I love the tension of that, because the city of Pittsburgh, for anyone who's been there recently, has the same tension. It's been gentrified in a certain kind of way. I mean, it's the state-of-the-art city for medicine, for robotics, for all this stuff. At the same time, they're still surrounded by old neighborhoods and old things that remind you of the old Pittsburgh. If you go downtown to the Point, where all these new big silver and glass buildings are, but there's still cobblestone streets with the streetcar tracks still in them. And they're right next to each other. I mean, that's Pittsburgh in a nutshell. And I thought, my God, the city itself is a character. It's as split as my lead character is. So that's how Daniel Rinaldi came about, and I have been so fortunate.
Dennis Palumbo is our guest. I dub him the creative therapist, a psychologist who specializes in working with creatives, but also writes tantalizing mysteries that people love.
The blurbs I've got from Sarah Paretsky, from Ridley Pearson, from Tim Hallinan, from Thomas Perry, I cannot believe the support my series has got. So I feel incredibly fortunate. And if you like psychological thrillers and you're interested in what might go on in the mind of a therapist, I think the books might be for you.
What do readers say about the Daniel Rinaldi series?
Many of my readers tell me that one of the things they like the best is the fact that it's in first person, and so they see what it's like to be inside the therapist's head, because we're with him in a number of very intense sessions with patients. You know, later on there's kidnapping, killing, snipers, and all the usual stuff that make crime writing so fun. But there's also that aspect, and it's really fun to write.
What are the upsides and downsides of telling Daniel's stories in the first person?
And it is a handicap, you know, because you want to know what the bad guy's up to. And you can't be in the bad guy's head. I'm only in Daniel Rinaldi's head. The good news is, in terms of suspense and twists, we only know what he knows. So the reader gets a lot of surprises and a lot of twists and turns. And we encounter a lot of people that we think are characters that we think are one type of person, because that's how Daniel perceives them. And then we learn there's someone else. So it's one of those things where, like all art, the restriction can work for you.
You mentioned the autobiographical dimensions of Pittsburgh and the common experiential traits that you and Daniel share. How do you develop authentic characters that aren't like you?
Well, one thing that's nice about having had 31 years of working with people of all genders, all types, all colors, a very significant character in my Daniel Rinaldi books it is a female black detective. And I know a couple, and I've had one or two as patients, and I've certainly had a number of black female writers. I have one black female director in my practice over the years. And so I've gotten a real earful. And they'll tell me if I'm wrong with Eleanor. And she's a very popular character. So I don't presume to be in the head of anyone other than Daniel. So remember, we're just getting Daniel Rinaldi's perception of someone. So I'm a little off the hook, because he can't know what's in Eleanor's head. You know, he can't know what's in anybody's head. a gay character, a handicapped character, he can't know. He can just surmise. And that allows me to say that the only perspective I have on them is Daniel Rinaldi's perspective, which is true because the only perspective I have on anyone who's not me is my perception of them, my experience of them. As one of my wonderful mentors, a psychologist named Robert Stollerow said, there's only subjectivity and context. There is nothing else. There is only this context, you and I talking, my subjective experience of you, your subjective experience of me. And we're co-creating the context as we talk. There is no other reality than that.
What are the things that bring creative people like us to your therapist's couch?
Well, the most common reasons are the traditions. I call them the usual suspects. It's writer's block, procrastination, fear of rejection, a lot of attendant anxiety because there's a lot of fear of failure, and depression because there's a lot of isolation. And underneath there is the sense, how entitled can they feel? Because, you're saying to someone, I want you to pay me to go watch something or read something that was in my mind and heart. And I want you to love it, and I want you to pay me to get it. That's a big hubristic statement. I mean, Goethe said, writing is so hard, you have to believe the world cannot go on without what you're doing. And so when people say, well, aren't artists narcissistic? And I always say, if they want to be successful, yeah.
We all have a little narcissism inside because nothing can be achieved without some level of self-confidence.
It's very, very hard to be a surgeon, to be a trial lawyer, to be a politician. It really is. Or to be a writer, or to be a director. And it's unbelievably hard to be an actor. So when people go, gee, aren't actors kind of full of themselves? And I think when you get beat up 24/7 trying to break in as an actor, how the heck could you not be full of yourself as a way to armor yourself? Because it's so hard to do. But this is true of all artists. I mean, I always love this quote from Robert Frost. He said, the one thing all nations of the earth share is a fear that a member of your family is going to want to be an artist. And that's true. I guarantee you, if you go to Syria right now and you talk to some family that's living in a little house and where they have to go get water from a well, they'll say to you, my God, my son wants to be a poet. What am I going to do?
What made you want to become a psychotherapist?
Well, it's interesting. It was my own experience as a patient in therapy. I'd always been interested in psychology, and I was a philosophy minor in college and had given some thought to being like a philosophy professor. So I found myself in show business because I could write and I was relatively funny, much less funny now, but I used to be funny. And my experience in therapy got me reading a bunch as a patient, rediscovering my interest in philosophy as well. And so I started taking courses without a clear picture in my mind that I was going to change my career. I just thought, well, as a writer, how could it hurt me to take some psychology courses? Over time, I started loving the courses so much. And then there was a chance to be an intern in a psychiatric hospital, and I took that as well. And I actually had a kind of a road to Damascus experience where I was having lunch with a producer at a restaurant. I don't even know if it's there anymore. It was called La Dome on Sunset Boulevard. And we were having lunch because he wanted me to write some movie. This was after My Favorite Year came out and K-9, another movie I worked on. And so he was trying to get me to, and I kept looking at my watch because I was late for the psych hospital where I was going to work with a group of schizophrenics. I was doing, believe it or not, I was doing play therapy and psychodrama therapy with schizophrenics. And I couldn't wait for the lunch to be over. So I'm driving down La Cienega like a bat out of hell. And I'm thinking, what's wrong with this picture? I couldn't wait to leave the lunch. I can't wait to work with these floridly psychotic people. And I thought, I may have to change my life. And it was kind of a road to Damascus experience. By the time I got to the psych hospital, I thought, I'm retiring from show business and I'm going to become a therapist. And that's what I did. It took 6.5 years because you have to be an intern for over 3,000 hours. And then in those days, you had to sit for a written exam and then take an oral exam. You don't have to do all that stuff now, but you did that. It was a laborious process to get licensed in California as a clinician. But I did it. And I was a little bit like Batman in the sense that nobody in showbiz knew I was doing this. I was taking all of my classes at night and on the weekends. So I was like Bruce Wayne during the day and Batman at night. No one except my new wife and my close friend knew I was doing it.
Was there a sense that at last this was a real job?
Well, I think she respected the fact that I was going to be a clinician so much. See, the problem, the reason so many of my friends thought I was crazy when they found out is I did really well in show business. The paradox for me is the best year I had financially in Hollywood was the year I got licensed as a therapist. And the last thing I wrote was a pilot for ABC that almost got bought. And I told my wife that if they buy it, I'm going to hold off putting out my shingle and run the show. And then I'll put out my shingle. But luckily, I guess for my patients, less so for me, ABC passed at the last minute. Funnily enough, when you look at the success of shows like Hacks, the series was about a bunch of young stand-up comics trying to break in to the business. But this was before stand-up comics were doing big shows on Netflix and Amazon, and there were all these series about, Mrs. Maisel and Hacks, all these shows now about people trying to break into the business. At the time, I remember Ted Harbert, the president of ABC, says a great pilot, but nobody cares about stand-up comics. So anyway, that was the transition. And I think, to be honest, it was my column that I wrote. I wrote a monthly column for the Writers Guild magazine called The Writer's Life. And that column built my practice. And people read it, started to call me, and I've been very lucky. Since then, I've had a really full practice. I think it doesn't hurt that the Writers Guild and the Directors Guild have very good health coverage for mental health treatment. I don't know if my practice would be what it was and is if it weren't for how good the mental health coverage is. Because one thing that both those guilds know is that creative people need mental health support. They just do.
We're with author and therapist Dennis Palumbo, talking everything from mysteries to movies and comedy. What some people don't know about you, Dennis, was that you were a comic regular at the Comedy Store during what many call the golden age of stand-up comedy.
So I knew Dave Letterman. I knew Freddie Prinze. I knew Kip Addotta. I knew Jeff Altman. I knew most of this, David Brenner. I mean, I knew these guys. We all hung out together. Gary Shandling was one of my best friends, the late Gary Shandling. I've known him. I knew him for 35 years. And so I knew all these guys. So I knew exactly what I was writing about because I had been through it. I had done the auditions there and, open mic night where, if you start bombing, you get the hook. I mean, I've been through all of it. And the paradox was I never wanted to be a stand-up comic, but I knew that in the audience were all these producers and directors. And I wanted to be hired as a writer based on my material. And what ended up happening is Gabe Kaplan saw me and we went out for coffee and he said, you know, you're not a very good comic, but you have really good material.
That was Gabe.
That was him to a T. And which was the beginning, by the way, of like an 8-year-long relationship. We had a lot of fun early in those days because I ended up traveling with them around the country. And you go to a city like Detroit or whatever, then I'd read every newspaper. So I got all the local names, all the local scandals and stuff. And we would make jokes about it and put it in his act. So he would go out on stage and go, what is it with your mayor and that girlfriend? And people would go insane because I had seeded all of those jokes into his act. Oh, it was a lot of fun.
As we are recording this conversation, I'm seeing on my feed the announcement of the passing of the great Bob Newhart at 94. What are your recollections of this icon?
Oh, I talked to him on the phone for an hour because TV Guide hired me because I was a therapist and a writer to interview him and Kelsey Grammer about what it was like to play therapists on TV. It was one of the best conversations I've ever had with anyone. And both he and Kelsey were very interesting. He said, I don't care how silly the character is and how stupid some of the choices he makes, but he must be seen as a good therapist. And if you watch those shows, both Dr. Hartley and Fraser Crane are good at being therapists. They may date crazy people or they may get caught up in some stupid event, but they're very good clinicians. And many, many viewers who were like suicidal would write them and say, I watched you on that show last night and I listened to what you said to that person and it kept me from doing it.
As a therapist, what has surprised you the most about your conversations with creatives?
I think the thing that was most surprising to me, it isn't now, but early in my years, is I've had as patients writers and directors whose work I have long admired and loved. And to experience how scared, anxious, frustrated they are, how much they struggle. You know, our fantasy is, I bet this famous writer never gets writer's block, or I bet this director always knows exactly what he or she is going to do when they walk on the set. None of that's true. The thing that's so striking to me is that not only is every successful creative person, not only is it true that they used to be a struggling creative person, even the successful ones still struggle. They still worry about how good it's going to be. They worry about their relationships. They worry about their kids. They worry about their legacy. One of my patients won an Oscar for screenwriting, and he came in, and the next time I saw him, and I said, congratulations. And he said, thanks, but I'm no Billy Wilder.
That is a powerful observation because across 160 interviews with creatives, self-doubt is a common characteristic.
And see, my thought is Billy Wilder has that job. That job's been taken. But this is how we all are. And Billy Wilder didn't think he was Ernst Lubitsch. So everybody's on these paths where, when I think of my own writing in my mystery novels, I think, well, I'm no Michael Connelly. I'm no Raymond Chandler. I'm glad people like my books, but you want to see something great, read The Lady in the Lake. So I'll point you to where you should be reading. Read The Concrete Blonde or read The Poet, my favorite Michael Connelly book. Do you want to see something great? Read that. So we all have those feelings that we're trying our best, but is it going to be enough? And who do we think we are? And I've had, my most striking event in that category, when I was an undergraduate at Pitt, University of Pittsburgh, a guest who spoke to the whole undergraduate class, which was thousands of people, was a best-selling New York Times nonfiction writer who wrote one of the biggest nonfiction books in the early 70s. Flash forward 30 years, she was my patient. And I never told her, hey, I saw, because when I watched her give her speech from the podium, the chasm between me and her in my mind was enormous. And my thought was, she's got it made. She's made it. I'll never get it. I'll know how she got it. But boy, she's on top of the world now. Then she became my patient 30 years later, and I learned about her life, her marriages, her childhood. She was a mess.
I remember a quiet moment with a very successful friend where we were looking back over our battles with imposter syndrome at every step of our careers. And she said, if you think it's tough chasing success, just wait till you get there. You've got the public image and the toys, but you're still broken.
Yeah, the reality is and I think this is both the good news and the bad news. The reality is we're all broken. Life is hard on everybody. And so I think it was Jim Carrey a couple years ago who said, I wish everyone could be rich and famous for one day and see what it's like. Because I have rich and famous patients. They don't walk around like they own the universe. They don't feel like that inside. They struggle. Now, I have a slightly skewed perspective because they're patients in my therapy practice. But my 17 years in show business with a lot of people who were very famous, who were not in my practice, if you spend any time with them at all, you see their vulnerabilities, their fears about how they're perceived, their concerns about their legacy. They're wondering, does my wife or my husband really love me? My kids think I'm an asshole. I have a number of patients who are the adult children of very famous people, and most of them thought their parents were assholes and didn't care about their fame and didn't care about their money. They would have rather had more parental attention, which they didn't get. See, the problem is, as Alice Miller, a late psychologist, said, our childhood is the air we breathe. So even if you come from, some very wealthy, privileged background, but your famous parent was traveling all over the world all the time, and you were raised by nannies and people like that, you may grow up thinking, am I not lovable? Did my parent not love me enough to want to hang with me? So you have a kind of mythology about how lovable you are. So then you go, well, maybe if I'm successful, I'll be lovable. Or maybe if I marry a beautiful model, I'll be, And so you start seeing how in our culture, we're almost socialized to think that material goods or the people we hang with or are the things that will define how okay we are. And the one thing that I have learned in my practice and even in my years in show business, everybody thinks the party's happening somewhere else.
We're having a fascinating visit with author, therapist, and Renaissance man, Dennis Palumbo. He writes the Daniel Rinaldi mysteries and for the last 30 years has been a therapist, focusing his practice on creatives like us. So we're all broken. We're all in this boat with depression, anxiety, and fear. How do we get through it?
You exist by making your own experience the prime experience for you. Number one, you stay in the present as much as possible. Number two, you try to derive your sense of satisfaction from the stuff that you do, not from the rewards or the results. The Hindus have a wonderful saying. They say the key to contentment is absorption. And it's very true. I notice when I'm not writing and I see somebody on the bestseller list, I'm seething with envy. I go, I know that guy's work. He's not that good. God damn it. If I'm deeply enmeshed in something I'm writing, I never think about that. When I'm absorbed in my own work, my chattering monkey mind, filled with envy and comparison and all those other things, goes away.
Just as attachment is the root of all suffering, absorption is the path to peace in the present?
Absolutely. It's very hard to do what the Buddhists call non-attachment. The only way you can do it is not be attached to the outcome. You can be absorbed in the writing and not be attached to the idea, if it doesn't sell, this is a waste of time. If it isn't a bestseller, I'm a failure. Then you're saying how things turn out are referendums on me. And that's such a danger and very, very much an aspect or an artifact of a capitalist culture. So you can tell I'm an old lefty from way back, but it is true.
Most recently, you were a creative consultant for the harrowing Hulu hit series The Patient, starring Steve Carell, and you wrote about it in the latest issue of Capital Psychiatry. How did you get pulled back into television?
It was such a strange experience because I've been retired from show business for 31 years, have never written for it again or anything. And then out of the blue, I got a call from Joel Fields and Joe Weisberg, the guys who wrote and created The Americans, one of the best TV shows ever. And they said, we're doing this series. They told me what it was about. And they said, we want you to consult on it because you're a therapist, but you're also a writer. And so that's how I became a consultant. They send me the scripts and I'd say, oh, therapist wouldn't say this. He'd say it like this. And so my job was essentially to make sure that the therapist character, and I didn't know, nobody knew it was going to be Steve Carell. They didn't cast it till it was all the episodes were written. So a lot of the things he says are things that I've said. A lot of his lines of dialogue come from me. Like a lot of his interpretations or his clinical choices, were vetted through me. And the more we worked together, the more my sense as I read their scripts is that Strauss was starting to sound a little bit like me, because they'd be on the phone with me for 2 hours and I'd be telling them stories of, things that had happened in treatment or, that once I saw that Steve Carell had been cast, and then I saw the footage, and he has this salt and pepper beard, and he has glasses. His mannerisms and his look kind of looked like me. And it never entered my mind that for my therapy patients, seeing him chained to a bed, and then, kidnapped, chained to a bed, and then ultimately killed on screen was going to be difficult for some of my patients.
Oh, no.
I mean, I was a moron. I think of myself as so psychologically sophisticated, but it never entered my mind until my patients started going, he looks just like you. And then they started getting mad, going, why is he treating that guy? Why doesn't he try to escape more? And then at the end, when, with a spoiler alert, he does not survive this experience. And so, my patients were like, great, I got to watch you strangled to death on television. And it was very graphic the way they did it. And I said, Jesus, why do they have to do it that way?
Sounds like an experience that opened up some opportunities for conversation.
The good news was what came out of it was very valuable for my therapeutic work with these particular patients, because we got to look into the sort of attachment issues, the transference issues, the amount of dependency that they had on how they perceived me and what I was doing and what I was like, their fears about me, and it helped me understand their childhood experiences and the way they viewed the world and what they thought of our relationship. So it ended up being actually therapeutically quite valuable to work with these patients.
Shifting gears, before we close, most of the world does not know that you spent 3 months living in Nepal, Kathmandu of Bob Seger fame.
And it was a very significant part of my decision to change my life and become a therapist. And it was the best decision I've ever made. I never looked back. But that was an astounding experience. it was very much a razor's edge kind of experience. And I guess because people know about it, they don't ask about it. But it was quite amazing because I was there in 1986 when it was still a Hindu kingdom, when the king was still considered an avatar of Vishnu. If you didn't have the king's portrait on the wall in your house, that's penalized by death. As, by the way, anyone who injured a cow. And now they have a parliamentary government and they have a bunch of other stuff. But I was there the last year or two that they were, and it's funny because the king was at that time, this is 1986, was the sixth richest man in the world. And Nepal's population was the fifth poorest. And there was this one main road at the end of which is the palace. And here's Kathmandu, and there's the palace. Very much like Edinburgh. When you look at the end of the Princess Street or whatever, it's Royal Street, there's the castle. The king's there. In the backyard or the back area of the king's palace is a helicopter, always gassed and always oiled for when the people would finally come up and kill him, and he could make his escape. And ultimately, the Communist Party had a big influence on bringing down the king and the royal family. They have a parliamentary government. There's still tons of corruption, but it's closer to being, a republic than it was when it was a Hindu kingdom. But I'll never forget because I saw the helicopter.
And the U.S. consulate there is another oasis that's very different from the area surrounding its protective walls and armed guards.
I was brought in there because I knew the head nurse of the Peace Corps. And so she brought me in. And when you go inside, it's Darien, Connecticut. It's hot dog stands, tennis courts, green lawns, sprinklers, and little golf courts that they literally replicated upscale Connecticut inside this walled compound. You wouldn't know you were in Nepal. You would think you were in Darien, Connecticut. It was one of the strangest things I'd ever seen in my life. The other thing striking, they loved American stuff. Now, when I was there was no radio, there was no television, but videos had just come in. So the nightclubs, the pubs and nightclubs would show videos of like Michael Jackson and also remember from the MTV days, all that stuff. That was their only visual that they had. And if you were a kid in Nepal and you had anything American to wear, you wore all of it. So you'd wear the American t-shirt and then put the American sweater on top of it, then the American jacket. If you had two American caps, you'd wear them both, one on top of the other. You wore everything that you had that was American at the same time. Someday I thought I'd make right about it in my, declining years, which are rapidly approaching. I told my son, I said, I'm in the final glide path. That's what Johnny Carson used to call it. He said, yeah, I'm in that final glide path. Well, I'm in there too.
I don't know if I'd agree with that definition. The man is Dennis Palumbo. He writes the Daniel Rinaldi mysteries. Panic Attack is the latest and greatest. His website is under renovation, but Google Dennis Palumbo, and his world will fill your browser. A true Renaissance man and someone who has inspired a number of us to work toward becoming the human beings we were meant to be. Dennis, time has flown by. Thanks for the conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you, Terry.
In Conversation with Terry Shepard is a copyrighted presentation. All rights reserved. I'm Lisa Davis. Join Terry Shepard next time in Conversation.